So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum. Yes, someone in the chat is already talking about it because Trump's words are definitely extremely serious. It's true that we've gotten used to him saying a lot of things, but what he's saying right now is extremely uncertain and extremely dangerous. For those who haven't been following, an entire civilization will die tonight, never to return, never to be brought back again. I don't want this to happen, but it probably will. Anyway, now that we've had a complete regime change, maybe different, smarter, less radicalized minds will prevail. Maybe something revolutionary and fantastic can happen. Who knows? We'll find out tonight. One of the most important moments in the long, complex history of the world. 47 years of extortion, corruption, and death will finally come to an end. God bless the great people of Iran. Now, what is meant by an entire civilization? It will disappear tonight. Someone has started talking about nuclear tactics. It's unlikely they'll give approval for something like that. Meanwhile, greetings to Professor Bognardi. Probably Trump, who is quite used to using rather strong language in the way he speaks. I don't think he cares. It was heading in that direction, also because the effects would be devastating for everyone, even for those who are not directly a target. Honestly, in recent days and hours, you can already see the Americans bombing many of the installations on Karg Island. We've said it several times. All the American movements make you think anyway that they will at least intervene on the islands. Otherwise, there would be no reason to move men from the 82nd Airborne Men onto the ship Tripoli and so on. And in the last few hours, they've actually attacked Karg Island, at least its military complexes. This suggests something. It's true that in previous days there was already some reconnaissance and scouting activity. Now nobody knows for sure. Would go and occupy Karg Island, but we've seen little common sense here. So let's say that since Putin's time, I've stopped doing rational analyses that assume the players involved are rational. They're not. Putin wasn't before, and Trump isn't now. So if we simply focus on what happens, on the sources we have, even if they lead you to the conclusion that it's an irrational action, you still have to follow it. There's no reason to move these troops to do reconnaissance on the island unless you really intend to occupy it. Otherwise, all this activity doesn't make sense. On Karg Island, in the last 24 hours, there have been strikes. Let's also look at what was hit, because this gives us some clues. It had already been hit about a month ago, but not heavily. If I'm not mistaken, only the anti-aircraft batteries were hit. This is an extremely detailed map of what was known to be on the island in terms of anti-aircraft batteries, missile systems, depots, radars, communication antennas, and so on. What's interesting is that the hardened storage bunkers were hit. What are hardened storage bunkers? They're basically the depots, the reinforced concrete ones where ammunition is usually stored inside. The ones that the Ukrainians have often attacked in Lipetsk, Russia. When you hit the depots, you limit the ability of the infantry, of the troops inside the island to basically resupply, their own weapons. It doesn't make sense to hit this stuff unless you want to invade. It made sense to hit some of the anti-aircraft systems at the beginning of the war because they were in the middle, as you can see, of the Persian Gulf. But going to hit every single communication system, depot, etc., makes you really think that they intend to occupy it. Occupying it, as was also discussed with Colonel Stirpe, won't be easy in the sense that it's still a man-to-man fight. Since if you go to fight in the loading dock area, it's all full, as you can see, of fuel depots. So you can't use bombs, you can't use artillery support, and so on. I said it, since Trump probably read in a briefing that 90% of Iran's oil passes through here, he probably ignored everything else they told him. Afterwards, he only understood the 90% oil part, and so he wanted or would like to grab the Iranians by the throat. At least that would be the intention. That's how it could also be put together. Part of them would be airlifted, part would be landing troops, but definitely with smaller ships, probably at night, using very fast and small vessels. You wouldn't see the Tripoli arrive there since you could spot it a kilometer away. And most likely other possible targets are the islands of Lesser Toonba and Greater Toonba. It's a bit more difficult to go and occupy the islands, even though they make more sense, the islands of Hormuz, because they're much bigger. There's much more to occupy. Anyway, the main points will come up soon too. That's why I said, let's think about it, because I realized that we try to give you all the possible information during the live streams. So it's also hard to have a moment to talk with you. Apart from some questions, I try to pick the most useful ones within the conversation. So we never have a quiet moment to reflect on what's happening. The question is where the US troops would depart from. Well, the last buildup we noticed of the 82nd and the Marines was at the Diego Garcia base, but within a few hours, overnight, they can move. Keep in mind that the 82nd and the battalions of the 82nd are built to be deployed anywhere in the world within 16 hours. So potentially, with planes leaving from Diego Garcia, they could very likely be in the area within about 34 hours. So they can decide at any moment to act in this way. Let's also try to take a broader look at what has happened during this period. Then we'll also look at how the American pilots were extracted, because it's still an interesting story regarding the downing of the F-15. Let's say this, Iran at the beginning had made a mistake with its strategy, in the sense that it responded by exposing a large part of its missile and anti-aircraft potential. And in fact, if you remember, on the first day, Iran responded with 350 missiles, then 185, then less than 100. So within 3 days, they had practically lost 80% of their firepower. This is because, obviously, the Americans and the Israelis had managed to gather information for months, so they knew exactly where to hit them. This is the first phase of the war. Up until March 7th, this is the first phase of the war. Afterwards, as you can see, the Iranians maintained a certain level of consistency. About 30 missiles per day and roughly an average of 50 to 100 drones per day. Notice that in the most recent period, they are starting to rise again. So if we want to understand what's happening, we need to realize that two completely different wars are being fought. So Iran, after March 7th, made a strategic paradigm shift, basically a change, and in my opinion, a smart one, considering their limited capabilities and resources. In what sense? besides the well-known Mosaic defense, which by its nature is, let's say, hard to neutralize, especially if you try to do it only using air power for obvious reasons. Distance, fatigue, limits on weapons payload, and the ability to stay in the air. Um, Not to mention that these attacking forces are limited anyway. Aside from Israel, which used a large number of aircraft compared to what it had available, the Americans, on the other hand, are much more limited. Between the aircraft carriers and some bases and some planes that still take off from European bases, then make stopovers and so on, this, among other things, greatly increases the logistical issues and makes them more difficult. Not to mention, from the point of view of personnel, the fatigue of men and equipment, and of course, the availability of ammunition on site. It's not like aircraft carriers have unlimited ammunition. So the nature of Iranian defense, besides spreading the risk because they have this layered mosaic-like defense, is above all decentralized. That is, even if the chain of command is lost, especially an anti-aircraft system, it still has a certain degree of independence. They simply turn on the radar from time to time, see what's in their area, and react. So they can also do it a bit like flashing lights in areas that might be considered safe by the Americans and the Israelis. Because there's no radar activity for a week, then suddenly, since the launchers are often mobile, they can change position. An area that was empty and dormant for a week suddenly becomes active. So they can even remain autonomous if there's no communication chain. Furthermore, there's the fundamental issue. The number of prepared positions, shelters, bases, bunkers is simply too large for American and Israeli reconnaissance capabilities. What do I mean by that? Given the nature of these anti-aircraft systems, which move quickly from one position to another, and the nature of the terrain, the country's topography, it's huge and full of mountains. Let's say that all this lends itself perfectly to the type of mosaic defense. So even if at some point there is some activity, it's really brief, and so it's not certain that the Americans or the Israelis always have planes in the area able to strike and react. This is one of their big problems, staying power. So these are also extremely important factors. Essentially, since they use the shoot and scoot tactic, meaning shoot and withdraw, they don't give useful windows to strike. Because everything happens within 5 to 10 minutes. So air power is not enough. Especially if it's the only way you have to attack, to hit a single anti-aircraft system that fires and then hides again inside the mountain. This doesn't allow them to do that. Yes, some people say you should do CD, dead, of course, anti-radar missiles that follow the radar signal, etc. But the activity is very brief. If, for example, what hit the F-15 wasn't a Bavar but a Tor system, which is located between two mountains, and maybe the F-15 was passing by, well, what range does the Tor have? About 20 kilometers, more or less. It locks on, fires, everything is over within a minute, and there's no time to carry out seed or dead. That is, missiles that seek out enemy radar activity and therefore follow the radar signal and go to hit the anti-aircraft system. Yes, the comeback of Shorad, exactly. Short-range air defense, basically, short-range defensive systems. They fire, they aim at the target, they shoot, they lock on 1 minute, 2 minutes, and it's all over. They close up the van and go back into hiding. They have an incredible amount of these, so they can keep doing this kind of thing. So what's the point of the strategy? That even though they lost 80% of their launch capability in the first week, which allowed the American and Israeli air forces to create corridors, actually it never completely stopped them. And this is evidenced both by the ongoing air losses, even if small compared to a war where there are two equal opponents, and also ongoing when it comes to the launching of drones and missiles. So all these limitations that this kind of campaign carried out by the Israelis and the Americans have allowed Iran to maintain a certain threshold of response capability, okay? Limited, but ongoing. But is it enough for the purpose? In what sense is it enough for the purpose? The purpose is not to counter the opponent's action tactically. That is trying to counter American and Israeli air supremacy, because if they deployed their assets to do so, they would be destroyed. So they only do it at certain times to keep, let's say, the whole area in a state of uncertainty. Also because they have certainly taken into account the possibility of losing production capacity. The factories and so on, those were already known to be lost. So they knew they had to manage the resources at their disposal carefully, both those that remained and those, let's say, temporarily unavailable because maybe the tunnel was buried by a missile. To do what? To carry out their own strategy. And what is the Iranian strategy? It has manifested itself this month in various phases of escalation, obviously, which have two key points in common. One is time and the other is Iranian resilience. This symmetrical strategy basically aims first to regionalize the war, and I would say they have succeeded in that. It's true, however, that the very nature of the place lends itself perfectly to regionalization. The strategic nature of oil and energy production in the Gulf countries and the related intrinsic dependencies that exist between many countries. And these monarchies give you few targets. In the end, if you hit the gas liquefaction facilities and the oil plants, you've basically taken away 80% of their capacity. And the other one instead is an orographic factor. If you want to turn this crisis into a regional one, well, what better place than the Strait of Hormuz? I see that it's easy to control and shut down. What's the purpose? The initial purpose was to regionalize it in order to amplify its effects and lead to the next escalation, which is a global crisis. Look, to practically project the costs, political and economic, and the related consequences on Americans. And honestly, they managed to do it. Because the final goal, so far, they've managed to achieve the first three objectives, which are to survive with a Mosaic defense, continue to generate pressure, regionalize the crisis, globalize the crisis, and make Americans pay for all of this on an economic and political level. But also the fourth point, which is the final one, that is to aim for the political and economic unsustainability of the American military action, which has all the limitations we mentioned, operational, logistical, and resilience limitations. By acting this way, the Iranians are also offering fewer and fewer targets, in the sense that the most the Americans can do at this stage is to expand the kinds of targets they strike. But it's not like if you take down one more factory or a power facility, it changes anything in the big picture. What the Iranians have saved to apply their own strategy is still there. Blowing up a bridge doesn't make the missiles, the drones, or the air defense systems disappear. So it's interesting to see that two completely different wars are being fought. One is tactical, and this is evident that American and Israeli tactical supremacy has exacted a huge cost. Destruction of launchers, ships, bases, submarines, the surface fleet no longer exists. The problem is that we focused a bit too much on the story of each individual ship destroyed, things like that, losing sight of the bigger picture. In the end, what is the main factor in this war? It's the strategic one, not the tactical one of how it's being fought, quote unquote, on the ground. So honestly, I don't see a way for the Americans and the Israelis. I've left the Israelis out because they're a separate issue, and we can talk about that. The Americans can't win this war, not because they can't militarily crush the Iranians, but essentially because when you don't have the ability to disrupt your opponent's production and logistics, etc., with air power alone, you can't achieve strategic victories. It's very difficult. I'll give you an example of a practically air naval victory achieved by the Japanese Empire at Pearl Harbor, which had tactical significance. They took out some planes, some ships, but they couldn't do anything to prevent the opponent from continuing to build ships. So in the end, it was simply a localized victory. It was the same problem that the Austrian painter had. He didn't have the ability to bomb. They never built. They never had a strategic air force. The Germans, and so they never managed to reach America either. There were some projects like the America Bomber Project, not to bomb the Russians when they moved their bases near the Urals or beyond the Urals. So when you lack that capability, if the opponent doesn't give up or doesn't collapse internally due to political issues, you won't get anywhere. You can only increase the type of targets you destroy, but as I said, it's not one more bridge or tunnel that makes the difference. In the meantime, thank you. I'll stop for a moment and we'll also take all the questions. Returning them to the Stone Age could mean eliminating Iranian oil and the monarchy's oil from the market long term, aligning with the goal of controlling global oil. Of course, if they take Karg Island and also destroy power plants, bridges, railways. By the way, Israel has sent a message to the Iranian population not to take the trains because they will destroy those too. Well, yes, technically, if you destroy all the infrastructure and take away their way to rebuild it, which is selling oil. As for the Iranians, technically you bring them back, not exactly to the Stone Age, but definitely to the Bronze Age. Stefan, did Iran establish drone factories in Tajikistan? No, those were the Russians, but not in Tajikistan, in Tatarstan. It's possible that the Iranians could also find some proxies, but you can't set up factories in just 2 months. And before this mess, you didn't hear about Iranian proxies elsewhere, also because certain countries don't want to get involved if something goes wrong. They've produced quite a few drones, so I think it's unlikely that anyone would want to get involved in this way. Up until now, there's never been any report of them setting up external drone bases. It's absolutely not likely, really zero chance, unless he's completely crazy, also because there aren't any big targets left. What is left can easily be destroyed with guided bombs. There's no need, so it's an exaggeration. Those are Trump's words. I understand they cause alarm, but no, there won't be any use of something like that. So don't worry, I know the media jumps on it because Trump's words are actually extremely unsettling and can be misunderstood. Not just his, but also Vance's, because Vance also more or less remained vague and wanted to reiterate what Trump said, which is this.
The entire country can be hit in one night, and that night could be tomorrow.
Why did I do this live? Because tonight could be that night. And I felt, beyond the fact that we provide information, etc., that I still needed to tell you that if really this kind of attack happens, so we reach a moment where there is no turning back, because there is the risk of reaching the point of no return, and we are very close to it. What do I mean? The point of no return. Up until now, what had happened was I hit some of your bases, some radars, some THAAD systems, you hit my launchers. It had more or less remained within the military sphere. American bases in Kuwait and other places were being hit, and Israelis and Americans were hitting bases, planes, ships, and so on. Iranians. But if they start hitting each other, especially between Iran and the Gulf monarchies, because it's the Gulf monarchies that could suffer from the Iranian retaliation, well, then you reach the point of no return. What do you mean by the point of no return? As we showed you in the previous live stream, these countries depend, in most cases, on large plants that produce 20 to 30% of their energy, oil, and so on. So just hit two plants and you take away 60% of their water, 60% of their energy, 60% of their oil production capacity, and therefore their ability to rebuild. Yesterday, the Iranians struck a very important Saudi production site. This is also confirmed by NASA firms. As you can see, where you see red and where there are basically heat signatures, and this tells us that they hit a very important facility. Why an important facility? Because this facility produces about 30% of Saudi Arabia's oil. It's called Jubail. Actually, it's an industrial conglomerate where fertilizers, petroleum products like plastics and bitumen, but above all, oil are produced. According to some estimates, it represents between 6 and 8% of the entire world's oil production, and between 25 and 30% of the oil produced by Saudi Arabia, okay? If this plant gets knocked out, the crisis becomes systemic, because it's not like in a month, if the war ends, this plant will go back to producing like before. If they start shutting down these plants one after another, it takes 45 years to rebuild a plant of this capacity. And what will the world do in these 45 years if the Gulf monarchies lose their capacity, and so do the Iranians? The crisis becomes systemic, as Giorgio Alfaraz was saying. A gigantic industrial hub of 1,000 square kilometers. Okay, that's why I say we're reaching the point of no return. If the Americans act as they intend to, that is destroying airports and ports, bridges, power plants, and so on, the Iranians, who don't have a great long-range missile capability, will take it out on all the Gulf monarchies, which are extremely dependent on a few major systems. And so it's the Samson strategy. If I go down, everyone goes down with me. They will annihilate each other. The Americans and the Israelis will destroy, let's say, Iran's industrial capability, and the Iranians will do the same on the other side. And this will lead to a crisis that will last for years, considering that there are few targets, but they are very large and very valuable. And I fear that Trump really, when this ultimatum ends, will act in this way. They had already started to show some things a couple of days ago, taking down one of the most important points. It's what the first Iranian was saying, that, and so that explosion, and so the now. We are very close. I say this because I imagine if someone has a company and has to transport 50 trucks, they already told me today on the highway that diesel was 2.51. Something like this can really reach absurd levels, 34 euros. To give you an idea, unless alternative sources are found. The strategic reserves of European and American countries last 1 month, 2 months, it depends on the country. Then you can put in all the billions you want, but if it isn't there, it isn't there. Just the other day, I saw flights being canceled precisely because they're trying to ration even aviation fuel. Diego Maria Tamburini, given the same lack of strategy, don't you think that religious motives are more important than we think, even on America's side? I don't know. How religious do you think Trump is? Trump, he puts on an act and pretends to be religious, but I don't really see him as particularly religious. They always put on a show for a certain kind of people, but he's not religious at all. I also want to address another fundamental point, because this idea that Americans have, but especially Trump, of applying it to Iran, the exact same formula they used with Venezuela, meaning let's remove the leader and then whoever comes next will make a deal. Did it work in Venezuela, right? It basically crushed it, made them reopen the embassy, and now quietly does business with the Americans, but it can't work with Iran. I've been lucky these days to talk to some intelligence experts who are extremely knowledgeable about Iran, and more or less all of them told me the same thing about Iran, at least for those who really know it, not the Americans. It has a regime that has managed to absorb very hard blows, including the decapitation of the regime. What do I mean by that? They've had decades to prepare for these eventualities, and they've created a structure that's much less centralized than it appears. In the end, Khamenei's role is more of a spiritual guide than a technical or practical one. And it's quite clear that it didn't rely only on those leaders. It didn't even, in short, depend on the leader. But what is this system based on? On various pillars that basically support the dome. Basically, each one is important, but no single one is essential. If one falls, it's replaced. So in the end, the structural collapse never happens. On the other hand, there's a really big risk, in my opinion. The other day, I watched a very long interview with the former director of EF, Bar, and also various game strategy experts say that the biggest risk now is the opposite of what they're saying. Trump, Vance, etc. That is, if we go and read Trump's initial tweet, he says, "We still carried out a regime change." He now claims we've achieved total regime change without understanding what they are. It happens. The ones who are there now are different, smarter, and less radicalized elements. They will prevail, which is exactly the opposite of what all the 20 or so analysts I've listened to have said, both privately and by following podcasts myself and so on. I mean, all the analysts who know Iran well and this kind of structure, that most likely, as the various leaders are eliminated and others emerge from the second or third ranks, the latter will be even more radicalized. Kind of structure in their actions. Why? They had to find for preservation, abandonment, postponement of respect for subordinates. And of the kind of structure, this kind of structure has a profile and a history, and therefore, being less well known, they can appeal less to authority, to their own image. So they basically get the opposite effect. This is another point. How do you explain that all the analysts have said these things you're saying, but the Pentagon and the CIA, on the other hand, have not? Barnes, the former FBI agent, says it, as do several other analysts I followed from ZEAS, the Center for Action Resilience, and many other organizations as well. I've also heard Israeli people saying the same thing, that yes, they took them out, but not for that purpose. Is regime change being talked about? No, simply because they were the chain of command. But they don't expect big things like this will completely revolutionize the regime or that it will fall and so on. You simply take out the leaders because they're the ones in charge at that moment. And so you create a vacuum that takes some time to be filled, but not with the aim of overthrowing the regime or expecting a regime change. This is what practically all the most serious analysts say. I've seen this from Kaufman and many others these days. I've listened to and read about 20 of them, and not a single one says otherwise, including the American ones. That shares the idea that if you take out the top ranks of the regime, then the regime suddenly collapses, and if anything, reforms for the worse. They'll be far more paranoid, and probably actually. I'm adding these because there was a great interview with an Indian host who often also invites Sarah Payne, who is a scholar of China-Russia relations, where this professor, an expert in game theory, said this, which will probably also lead to terrorism against America, financed by Iran or others, because it's the next step after the super radicalization of the new ones. And the fact that they realize that the direct missile action leads to this kind of intervention, so they've lost their proxies almost all around the Israelis, but they could develop new ones. So we could even go back to a period like 10 or 15 years ago, meaning the time of attacks, especially in Israel and especially in America. And then I noticed something else. If you look at who the Israelis and Americans have killed, you'll see that almost all the leaders who have been taken out are not from the regular army. They mainly tried to take out the Revolutionary Guard and leaders more connected, let's say, to the ideological and doctrinal vision and so on. The more operational ones from the army, on the other hand, less so, because the army is a bit less fanatical, at least the regular one, even though actually even less. For you, well done. This week in China, a decrease in the price of petroleum derivatives like benzene, ethylene, and propylene is expected. Now, however, it keeps rising. Yes, because there's also that problem. And also with fertilizers. China had also greatly increased its own reserves. Facts. And so it's not something that can be done just like that. In the last 2 years, probably in anticipation of a mess like this, less so for other countries that are more dependent, especially Asian countries. So that's the situation. I don't want to be alarmist, but if you're just citizens and you don't have a company, a couple of things you can do, but if you have a company, there's nothing you can do about it, because where would you store it? I mean, you can't stockpile gasoline for 50 trucks, but if they attack, it's inevitable that the crisis will become systemic. And so everything that is ordered from China will inevitably become more expensive. And many other things. And there aren't many tools that Italy can use, like removing the excise tax for a while to ease what is a systemic crisis and not just a crisis lasting 2 or 3 months. There, inevitably, you have to make agreements with other countries to find other suppliers. Now, fortunately, we are not so dependent. Europe did not import so much from the Gulf countries. But if you go to buy something on Amazon and so on, not right now because the logistics cycles are long anyway, but it will definitely cost more, especially if it comes from another part of the world, just to give you an idea. So I myself want to see if he'll chicken out again. Trump always chickens out. I mean, Trump always acts like a chicken, which is American slang for saying he backs down, or because by now it's been 3 times that he postpones the ultimatum, or if this time they will really attack. This is rather worrying overall, given what's happening. So, as we can see, Iran continues exactly with the same tactic, no more, no less. You can see the activity figures, more or less, they always remain the same. Missiles in red, drones in blue from March 11 to April 6. In fact, we can see an increase regarding drones, and this is the overall picture from March 2 to April 6. The point is that for them, this level of pressure is more than enough to globalize the crisis and go on to destroy the Gulf monarchies' facilities. So it's not like they need to return to previous levels, also because such a large deployment only exposes them to risks. Let's also talk about how they managed to get the F-15 pilots out. Because in my opinion, it's quite interesting, especially from a doctrinal point of view, this American idea of never leaving a man behind. Why? Because this, let's say, improves things. The number of people willing to go on dangerous missions, knowing that if something happens to you, they'll come to get you. We made a short about it and condensed it, but actually, if we look at the details, it's even more interesting than what is being said. We've seen it because in a short, you can't put everything. At the beginning, we saw various American planes and helicopters, including the Black Hawk, I mean a derivative of the Black Hawk. If I'm not mistaken, it was the Pavehawks flying around. Some of them were deliberately sent to the wrong areas so that the Iranians would think they were there, and so they focused on watching where the Pavehawks were going. What happened is incredible because the Americans basically landed. They landed, okay, with some C-130S on a valley. And then it's not exactly clear what happened to the C-130s, whether they got messed up because landing on this kind of terrain isn't ideal anyway. Some say they got bogged down, while others, looking at the images, say that instead. They blocked each other when they were trying to take off. I mean, it's not exactly a collision, but if you look at the positions of the planes, they're not consistent with how you would normally take off. As you can see, they're all too close to each other. These are the images of the destruction. These are silhouettes. Yes, I say bogged down, but I mean it's extremely rough terrain. You could even lose your wheels. Notice that if two planes have to take off and they're in this position, one is blocking the other. Now, it's not known if they parked them this way because one was already unusable, so they put it in front to act as a shield. Or if something happened and in the rush to take off, I don't know, one turned, got damaged, and blocked the other. We don't know, but it's very strange that when they had to take off, they ended up in this position, and we don't even know if they tried. No, they didn't crash when they landed. Or they put it there to provide cover since it was unusable, and in the meantime, it provided cover because, I mean, it provided cover. Because besides this story about the planes that landed, at first they provided cover both with the Pave Hawk and maybe even the A-10S. At the beginning, only these two planes landed here. Then after they got bogged down, something happened. They got stuck, or they put them there like that because they couldn't take off anymore. The little birds also arrived. The little birds are the helicopters that carry special forces, those ones, if you've seen them. Black Hawk Down. Do you remember those small ones that went to strafe when they fired the strobes over the Somali positions? I mean, in the end, in the final scene of this story, in total, 4 helicopters and 2 planes were lost, meaning the 2 planes we saw were lost. Along with them, 4 Black Hawks. And they left with another wave of perhaps Black Hawks that took them away. What you see are the wrecks of the C-130 and the wrecks of at least 2 little birds. This thing here is interesting. Or, as someone says, they could have been inside the plane and who knows, maybe they landed. Often they also let them out from the C-130 SC. Anyway, it was an extremely expensive mission because also they said the first pilot had been rescued and the news was false. Why was it false? Because they were trying not to give the Iranians a reason to start a manhunt. The second one was pulled out 36 hours later. He climbed a 2,000-meter mountain and hid in a cave, and every now and then he would turn on his signaling flashlight. By the way, they didn't even trust that it was him, so they had to ask him some questions. Agreed questions. There's a whole procedure that's carried out before the missions, meaning agreed questions, keywords, and so on. And so they thought it could be a trap because it's not certain that il beacon, the one being activated, was his, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was already under Iranian control. By the way, the Iranians were broadcasting clips and so on everywhere on TV, so much so that people would go from time to time. There were videos of people in civilian clothes shooting at American helicopters and C-130s. Actually, they were people who had gone looking for the reward because they were offered 60,000, I don't remember their currency, to go get them, and in the end they got them out, but at a huge cost. I don't know if the 8 and the one they talked about in the previous days was also involved in this story, but definitely here a couple of Black Hawks were damaged, 4 helicopters lost, 2 C-130s, and the F-15, of course. An incredible mission just to try to recover 2 pilots. This means there was a strong interest in not giving the Iranians a prisoner. Otherwise, they would have made a show of it or something. I highly recommend this Substack, which tells this story in great detail. It could even be worth a movie. Because those were surely 36 terrible hours for the co-pilot. But it gives you an idea that the Iranians are still active. They're able to create things. Yes, Commander 61 is very good, really good. It's true that he goes into a lot of detail, even on technical matters, but I absolutely recommend you read it. If you want to get the real story, not from the newspapers, forget the newspapers. If you want the story truly well done and complete, go to this Substack and you'll find it all there. Not the nonsense, not the reconstructions from the newspapers, which are extremely partial and limited. Now, in my opinion, Paolo should be coming on any moment now. I wanted to open a small page, right? Since I even put information in the title the other day, out of curiosity, I started. I watched a few clips, let's say from television, and I noticed something quite peculiar, which is actually something many people who follow this channel already know, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. I mean, I was also watching some old debates from these years between the various people who were at the SED and so on. About 50%, they always ended up with personal attacks. I mean, they attack each other. And in the other cases, there was no analysis, there was no presentation of anything other than that person's ideological position with regard to Iran or with regard to the Americans or with regard to the Russians or with regard to the Ukrainians. They were shouting at each other. That's the best case. About 50% of the time, they talked over each other, attacked each other, and there was more focus on delegitimizing the other person. And above all, I noticed this, which was also in a way confirmed by various TV personalities. They are more interested in making sure that if they invite guest A, guest B must have an opposing position to guest A, not necessarily a truly opposing one. And so I asked myself, where is the journalist's job in all this? Am I just someone who lines up people to yell at each other? Is that the journalist's job? Or should the journalist's job be to refute what A says and what B says and see if either of them bases things on facts, on evidence, on sources, and therefore stop inviting the one who doesn't bring anything to support what he claims? No, the purpose of journalists, from what I've seen, is to find guest A and guest B who think differently. Then it doesn't matter if both base their opinions on absolutely nothing as long as they make a scene. Thank you.
Hi, Paulo. Sorry for being late. Sorry for being late. I really need to start using a planner.
Yeah, that's right.
I publicly confess that.
I'll get you a secretary. I was talking about. I talked about the beginning part, you know it, right? The one I sent you, I read it.
I read it. Very interesting and nice, yes.
I had written down what I thought about this war, so since you know it, you can give your opinion. And then I was talking about the news media, about the fact that on TV they invite guest A, guest B. The journalist doesn't check if A or B are right, as long as A thinks the opposite of B. That's just fine. They argue, they get ratings.
That's true, but it's also our fault, the fault of those who.
Because they watch them.
If you, when faced with something a bit more complex, change the channel, I notice it. If you listen to Lucio Caracciolo, who is really good and also very thorough, but he has a certain way of speaking compared to others. For example, with Dario Fabri, you're automatically drawn to the showmanship. You find Dario Fabri easier to listen to than Lucio Caracciolo, regardless of what is being said. That's our fault, because we don't pause to look past how it's said and ask what information we're actually being given. And both are excellent. Caracciolo's and Fabri's are definitely excellent. But the thing is, we don't feel like getting informed. We just want to know how the game ended. We don't want to see everything. We just want to know if our favorite team won or lost. And television adapts because it lives off advertising, so it depends on someone who is watching the game at that moment. And so, but you see, for that part of the audience that doesn't relate to it, and this is even worse for newspapers, which after all would actually have the time and space. Because if you have 10 seconds to say who wins and who loses, or if someone has an atomic bomb, well, that's the kind of question I get asked, not always, but often. The newspaper has all the space and freedom to really make the case and dig into things. And yet, if you look at the newspapers, even the way space is allocated to this or that topic says a lot. But people want to know this. What is that based on? Why do people want to know this or not want it explained to them? Diesel is at 2.20 euros per liter and gasoline is at 1.80 euros. That's something they might actually be interested in, knowing if there are real prospects in the coming months or years for this to go down. With the data in hand.
I'll give you an example. Il Giornale, Trump, an entire civilization will die. Tonight, the Pope warns it's unacceptable. Palazzo Chigi says the people shouldn't pay for the regime's faults. In other words, those last two statements are useless. They don't explain, in other words, honestly, with all due respect for the Pope or what the Chigi Palace says, they don't explain to people what it means. Trump implies a whole civilization will die tonight, suggesting he's talking about launching nuclear weapons. This means I spent 60 minutes before you arrived trying to explain what they're doing, what the strategy is.
But if you say you'll wipe out civilization after Hiroshima, what do you think? You think that automatically, what do you do to the other side? Do you cut off their gas? If you think in conventional terms, wiping out a civilization means embarking on a war that lasts 5, 6, or 8 years, bombings day and night in stages, those things you don't see anymore and can't even do anymore because of lack of resources. Even if you wanted to repeat the bombing of Dresden, ce le hanno le cose per farlo.
And then you think there aren't even any worthwhile targets left.
When you declare that an entire civilization is the target, even Mrs. Cicera, who's hanging out the laundry somewhere in the province of Tehran, becomes a target. Trump said this, whoever is in there, so if they belong, if they are part of that civilization, that people, the people will be wiped out. Imagine Trump's face.
He didn't even talk about regime. No, not there.
He destroys everyone. Where did he call them bastards? It's not here. Maybe it was the one before, right?
He posted a lot of tweets.
He calls them stubborn idiots, bastards. Basically something like that, and whoever's here is here, but at least here, if nothing else. He ends by saying, God bless the great people of Iran, then I'll kill you all, but you'll die by my hand.
Let's say this sentence here clashes with the last one. I mean, make up your mind. Either he doesn't really know the proper use of the word civilization because it's obvious that it also includes the great people of Iran.
Or not. Or maybe he means God bless them in the sense that he sends them all to him, and at that point the Almighty will take care of it. 90 million people who have done nothing but live in the wrong part of the world, according to what he says. What does Trump say? But there was a philosopher named de Maistre who said that the corruption of man begins with the corruption of language. And starting from the corruption of language, ideas become corrupted, behaviors become corrupted, societies become corrupted. So having the leader of the biggest world power, or the one who still considers itself the biggest world power, using this kind of language, if he really puts into practice what he says, we'll really be in trouble starting tomorrow morning. If you don't put it into practice, there's a saying from Rome, but it doesn't really apply here. I repeat, when you do it, they respond to you. Let's say you're not taken very seriously for future threats, let's put it that way, and you can't afford them one way or another. There has never been anyone in the history of the 20th century who has used with such stubbornness and consistency a language that doesn't fit. It demeans the office. And what Donald Trump doesn't understand is that he holds the office of President of the United States. That will be held by someone, I don't know who, but in the future it will be held by someone else, and in the past it was held by others, we remember. Lincoln, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, even Biden. For heaven's sake.
You know, Paolo, that I can predict what he will do. The next American president will spend his 4-year term spending his time apologizing to half the world.
And yet there's always the question of when he will apologize, and everyone will say, yes, we accept, for heaven's sake, we understand. But then the unspoken question will be, but how the heck did you manage to elect him? If your system allows this, do you have some serious problem? And so the reputational damage can affect the law firm. It can affect a young woman of marrying age, as they used to say. A nation so big can't even be touched by reputational damage. Look at Putin's Russia. He has Medvedev say the nonsense if something big needs to be said. But have you ever heard Putin dare to say, we will annihilate, we will disappear? He hardly ever speaks. And the kind of language that made us laugh was reserved for Medvedev and the talk shows. Because if he does that, I mean, if that guy speaks. I mean, when Putin talked about nuclear options, he said this: if the territory of the Russian Federation were put in serious danger, all things considered, you almost feel like replying, well, of course, that's the least you could expect. He didn't threaten to drop bombs or to sink anything. It wasn't Putin with the giant, fantastic bus, it was Great Britain.
There's a question. How is it possible that no one stops him? How is it possible that all this is happening? I'm pretty terrified. We will have indirect economic consequences. I think you know what the problem is. They've never had a disruptive president. Let's call it disruptive. I think that's the mildest term I can use. Like this one, who really pushed the boundaries of decency and the system of checks and balances. I mean, the harshest thing Bush or Obama could say was nothing compared to Bacolina, so they never really tested it. When someone finally came along who actually tested it, they realized maybe it's a bit of a blunt instrument.
Yes, and secondly, they realized that part of their democratic structure is missing. Do you know where Congress is right now? On vacation because they have summer recess, spring recess, and for a month Congress is out of session because they're on vacation. I mean, there's a war going on, they're supporting another war, and as a political signal, Congress goes on vacation for a month. There's the aspect, the unofficial counterbalance of the American Congress that lets this president do as he pleases. And the bad weather with some light rain. Opposition from guess who? The Supreme Court leaving the governors of the states with the most striking opposition. The latest was from Eyes, who said, let people shoot in the middle of my street. Absolutely not. Where are the other branches of government in the United States? They actually have great power. If not an act of censure, they can at least make symbolic gestures. If they wanted to, instead, this man has been given free rein with an inner circle of people who, in my opinion, are more dangerous than he is. White, the one who compared him to the risen Christ, just think about it. Take any president from anywhere, the King of Spain, and you see someone comparing him while he's present to the risen Christ. You see that it doesn't work. This is extremely serious and we will all pay for it, but the Americans will pay for it the most. Why? The most important asset a nation has, especially in situations like this, is its reliability, not just financially or economically, but its ability to keep its promises. For better or worse, if you make a promise for something good, keep it. If you make a promise for something bad, keep that too. That's why we try not to go overboard. Those of you who are movie enthusiasts, do you remember? There's The American President, a movie with Michael Douglas. He plays the role of the President of the United States, and at a certain point, he has to order an attack on a Libyan base. And one of his assistants, when he makes the decision to bomb, says, he did something very presidential tonight, and he replies, tonight you saw me do the least presidential thing ever, because I'm ordering the death of two people who don't even know that in 2 hours they'll be dead. In contrast, we have someone who laughs about having killed 6 people on a bridge who were just passing by, going who knows where. And he claims it as something smart, something good. He's not ashamed of it. I mean, there's no shame in the death he caused. And this is truly frightening. Thank you.
It brings post-Gulf War changes, new gas and oil routes, previously unthinkable alliances, fresh momentum, and non-fossil energy sources. First, we need to get past this and think about the systemic crisis if this attack really happens. And so there will be a back and forth destruction of facilities that will have an effect over the years, not months, for all the factors we mentioned earlier. Few structures, but very large ones, which represent a large percentage. From there, there's no turning back. And why does it become systemic? Because obviously, when it becomes systemic in the future, it's not like it goes back to the way it was. In the future, investments will definitely go towards risk diversification. That is, I take a bit from here, a bit from there, and so on. Nothing stays the same. But if it becomes systemic, it's a big burden for everyone. I wanted to ask you this, Paolo. I feel it a lot. I'm rarely someone who sees dangers in the war in Ukraine. I've always been someone who tries to calm things down. A calming effect on everyone who made videos with the atomic mushroom cloud just to get clicks. But there's no atomic mushroom cloud here precisely because there isn't one. And it's much easier to cause a global crisis by destroying just a few key facilities. I see a long-lasting effect which will have a big impact on my life and yours as well. Every time we go to a gas station, every time we order something, every time we buy a kiwi or a crate of bananas, the price will inevitably go up because most of the transportation anyway is by road. I'm someone who orders often. All those poor couriers who come here, the Bartolini guys, will it go up? Like, will DHL go up? Does it matter to me? Effect. It's an effect that matters to me. Avrà un impatto su tutti i livelli perché that matters. It matters to me. That matters. It matters to me. That 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 matters to me. It matters to me. It matters to me. That matters to me. Things connected to this. And this time I see it as real. The risk, we're one step away.
I've done a bit of research on these things because I asked myself the obvious question. Excuse me, if 20% of hydrocarbon products pass through there, what happens to the other 80%? If you have 100 euros and you lose 20, you still have 80 left in your pocket. Sure, you get a little upset, but it doesn't really change your day. So why all this fuss? Because the term is wrong. It's true. It seems like 25%. I wrote it down because I did some research. So if I look away, bear with me. I need a few numbers. Before the war, through the Gulf or the Strait of Hormuz, about 20 million barrels of oil and derivatives passed through there every day, which was 25% of the trade and 20% of the consumption of these things. Where's the problem? Not all oil is the same in the world, meaning there's sweet crude, which has little sulfur, and sour crude, which has a lot of sulfur. Not all refineries in the world can refine both types, so entire parts of the world have been built to refine one or the other. For example, oil from the Gulf, which is sour crude, so it produces a lot of sulfur, and if you give them sweet oil, like from the North Sea, you damage them, and vice versa, and vice versa. So the impact of this 20% reverberates much, much, much more.
Because it blocks your other productions in the mix.
Production of sulfur.
From sulfur, yes. The Iranian one is one of the best. So you use that to cut it, so to speak, or anyway, you can refine it and it's easy to refine. The Venezuelan one, for example, is terrible. Yes, it's really awful.
And then there's the byproduct of Gulf oil, which is sulfur. With sulfur, you produce aluminum. With sulfur, you extract. With other things, you extract fertilizers. So you also have to expect, considering that at the same time you put an embargo on the second largest fertilizer producer in the world, which, just your luck, is the Russian Federation. So what you can produce in the Persian Gulf, you don't produce. What you can buy, you've decided not to buy because it's not ethically right. And in the end, you end up with large parts of the world that rely on fertilizers for food reasons, not to have tomatoes or cherries, but just to be able to survive. You find yourself in a major food crisis. Let's talk about helium. If something breaks, almost all the helium is produced in Qatar as a byproduct of oil processes, and it's Qatar that produces it in significant quantities. So what do we do with helium? Nothing except that it's needed for extracting rare earths, for medical equipment, for MRI machines. I noticed it in Tripoli because all the MRI machines were blocked, brand new, because there was no helium. I didn't know helium was needed, but a chief physician explained it to me in Tripoli in Libya. So we're already experiencing the effects now, the difference between gasification and liquefaction of gas. The ones to turn it from liquid back into gas are plants that cost a few million euros, but they're not very expensive.
The regasification plants that are off Livorno and Piombino.
Yeah, what really costs a lot is the plant to liquefy the gas. For example, if a plant to turn it from liquid to gas costs $100 million, the one that turns it from gas to liquid costs $4 billion. Just to give you an idea. And that's where almost all of them are, especially for us. So you see, by choosing to concentrate so much production in that part of the world, it immediately exposes us to a big mess. Just imagine what happens if there is a systematic destruction of everything that's there. From the desalination plants, whose destruction would make it impossible to live there, to the plants, to the petrochemical industry, let's say, that allows us to survive. And if Trump decides to flatten that, the war in Ukraine teaches you that. These days, the Ukrainians keep bombing Russian refineries without much trouble with drones. I mean, it's not something that, and we're talking about people who have some anti-aircraft missiles. I'm talking about the Russians, right? I mean, if they want, they have some systems to shoot them down. And even so, they still get through. So just imagine a situation where there are really very few anti-aircraft defenses. In the Gulf, where the facilities are gigantic and the flight times are minimal, what chance do they have of survival, huh?
Look, this is the NASA firm's image of Jabil, one of the largest industrial plants that produces everything from aluminum to steel. Oil that has taken up 1 million square meters of industrial complex. All the red dots you see are heat traces detected by the NASA firm's satellites. And then there are also videos that confirm basically that there are flames and so on. This is 25 to 30% of Saudi Arabia's extraction capacity, just to give you an idea. 58% of the world's traffic passed through here. 60 million tons of petroleum products passed through this. As I mentioned at the start of the stream, they have few of them. Few plants, very large ones, also because it's logistically easier to centralize everything, since many of these productions can be interconnected. So if they really take the big step and start taking down the Iranian industrial system, well, inevitably they can only respond in one way, by hitting the Gulf monarchies' facilities. And so that's where we'll find ourselves.
The shocking thing is that after 4.5 years of war in Ukraine, where we've seen it on both sides, that with drones I can cause damage, I can cause serious damage. They produced them, they even invented drones themselves. And you can't understand that they'll come and get you anyway. Do you think you can go looking for drones all over Iran and find them all? Good luck, because the Russians have been trying for 4 years to find all the garages where Ukrainian drones are produced. With 3D printers, with Mrs. Cesira, and they can't manage to stop the production. And that production inflicts severe damage to the Russian industrial system. And since there are armies deployed, right now there aren't any armies deployed, but it inflicts very serious damage on both armies deployed. Don't you understand that this war isn't fought only with A-10s, with F-35s, with satellites, with whatever you want?
I won't ask a question that I tried to answer at the beginning. I watched, as I said, about 20 analysts, these commentators from the former FBI director Baz, and they all share the same point of view, which is the opposite of Trump's tweets. That is, when you get rid of part of an administration like that, the ones who come up from the second or third tier are even worse because they're less well known. So they have to make themselves noticed, known, and feared. More paranoid and more radicalized, so you get the opposite effect. And I wonder, and this is my question, but is it possible that no one inside the Pentagon, among the analysts and so on, is there no one explaining to those in charge that these things are the opposite of what they're trying to achieve? Aside from the fact that we've seen generals being removed, and that makes me think that maybe...
I mean, maybe someone tried, or you're a hero, and then you take 38, 40 years of your career where you worked your tail off in Germany, South Korea, sent for 4 years to Alaska, and just for saying, look, maybe we shouldn't do this, you find everything you've done thrown away. And so if you decide to be that kind of person, you fall into the hero or missionary category, and that's worthy of respect. Normal people take a calendar and say, if I keep quiet for 2 years, this won't be around in 2 years. I just have to survive this. And you do what you normally do. Yes, yes, that's certainly true. Definitely, yes, not now, tomorrow morning. You try to slow down the effect of decisions because if you want to, you can do it. Not to enthusiastically go along with the idea because sometimes this is missing, sometimes you need that, another time something else is missing. Let me explain. I think someone also does this within the military organization. But you can't expect an agency that serves those in political power to oppose that political power. Because after all, it's worth remembering.
Here, too, there's a point of contention within the American armed forces because they say we always swear allegiance to the country and the Constitution, not to the temporary occupants of the White House.
That's what MacArthur said, right? Yeah.
Yes, and he was right. I mean, if they give you an unlawful order, that was a big debate among the soldiers, especially during the mess with Venezuela in the last few months. Well, since you swore to defend the country from both external and internal enemies, if they give you an order that's not legal, you have every right to object. That's why, moreover, Hexet in the previous months, 67 months ago, had started to fire many of the, let's say, legal advisors within the army. That is, those whom a soldier goes to for help when he receives an order that he believes is not legal.
Also, keep in mind that within the armed forces, there will also be, and there will be more than one, those who say that it's absolutely right to do things this way. It was about time. I mean, he says, I enlisted in 85 with the idea, with the hope of bombing Tehran, and finally now I'm doing it. You have to consider that there's a good part that enthusiastically approves of this initiative, also because they're not built to make assessments that go beyond their technical field. They're extremely technically prepared. They can do very complicated things, but when it comes to, but do you understand what happens if you do this? Well, they're always caught off guard by this question. Whatever you ask them to do, they're technically able to do it much better than anyone else, maybe in the world. The question to ask is why, or the consequences of what you do, because that's really outside of their training.
And I also see some systematic things. I mean, what we thought was just a piece of news, right? Like this one, which is from February 2025. Cinque. Remove the lawyers who help the military with controversial issues, change some of the Navy chiefs, give a little speech to the generals. You're ugly, dirty, mean, and out of shape. Try to man up a bit, do what I tell you, remove the operations commander. When that anti-terrorism event happened in Venezuela, right? Anti-trafficking, I mean, these are all things, pieces that have helped make, let's say, the armed forces more malleable and less able to say no. Because it still does, Punisin 1 and Ducano 100. I mean, he removed the chief of staff. Like if tomorrow Meloni wakes up and gets rid of Chief Dragone, just to give an example, right? Another very high-ranking, top-level person, just like that. Overnight, even if maybe he still had another 2 years of command.
Yeah, that's kind of what Putin did at the beginning, let's say, for the first 2 years of the war in Ukraine. How long did it usually last? 3 months, 4 months? Yeah, but the others, at least there was the idea that I'm removing you because you made a mess of things. I might not have put you in a position to win, but you did everything possible to lose. So all things considered, let's try to see if someone else can do a bit better. Here the purge is even preventive. Even before I make a fool of myself, I eliminate the one who could prevent me from doing it. And I have to tell you, it's not a good time for the United States. It's really not a good time. We should be worried not about Iran, but about the United States, because because they've taken a turn that the world doesn't understand. And when the world doesn't understand, then it looks for someone who understands better, looks for a more stable balance, looks for something that gives it more confidence, something more reliable. Let's take the example of what he started saying about NATO. You don't do this, you don't do that, you don't help us, you don't give us bases. So based on the points I've tried, you're useless. Period. Then maybe it won't work at all. But the prime ministers of 4 important European countries have started to think seriously whether they should. Not to buy weapons from the Americans, but to start coming up with a system that increases Europe's self-defense capability. Something they had never done in their lives. And it's not rearm Europe, it's the states that are starting to tell us, let's come to an agreement. Thank you.
And thank you. Government bonds, the French who have withdrawn from everyone. Thank you all. Sea bien what Trump wants to do. Thank you. Etc. Iranians, the same thing happens on the other side, and it's a worldwide mess, but because in the middle there are also, thank you all, the Iranians obviously sent there by the regime, but partly also for their own reasons, who basically physically positioned themselves to protect the bridges. Thank you.
Thank you too.
So it would also become a humanitarian tragedy beyond the military clash. If they bring down a bridge and there are 10,000 people on it or something like that, also because bringing down Iran's bridges in terms of bringing down the regime from a military point of view, since it can't invade, what purpose does it serve?
I don't know if it's said in Tuscan or also in Italian. It's like a tantrum, stomping your feet on the ground because you don't get what you want.
To hurt you just because I can hurt you, but there's no real thoughtful objective in bringing down a bridge in a country you know you can't invade except just to hurt you. That's it, period.
Exactly, but in soccer they're called frustration fouls. Since you're not doing what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it, you're not recognizing my leadership, you're opposing me, and I know that all I can do is play petty games with you. Because in the end, that's what it is. Without realizing that the referee doesn't just annoy you, if you really start causing trouble, he'll kick you off the field. That's why, from a strategic perspective, the one who has the most to lose in this situation isn't Iran. It's the whole world that's in trouble. Because if a war starts because of you, they're going to hold you accountable, not Iran.
We'll see what happens in the next few hours, but they will definitely be tough hours. I'm also keeping an eye on the stock market, the movements, and so on.
What's it doing?
Israel is doing quite a bit of damage, especially, of course, to oil futures and things like that. But in the meantime, the Israelis have already started to destroy bridges and so on. What I showed you earlier was a bridge being hit while civilians were driving underneath it, but this is another bridge.
On the eve of the Jewish Passover, Netanyahu, in a speech that not many people heard, came out with something like this. Passover commemorates the passage of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt to freedom in Israel, and to facilitate this passage, the Eternal Father sent the 10 plagues upon Egypt. Pause. I am sending the 10 plagues upon Iran. Now, with all due respect, if you compare someone to the Eternal Father, you end up comparing them to Christ as well. The other one, acting like the Eternal Father, sending plagues upon Iran, should get a dose of humility and understand that you're not playing at being omnipotent.
Also notice something, Paolo. All the bridges that the Israelis destroyed are in the north of the country, coincidentally right on the border with the Kurds.
Do you think the Kurds will help the Israelis? No, not at all.
The fact is that the Iranians have still bombed a lot in the Kurdish area, and here they're destroying all the logistical routes to isolate the region. And even Trump said that he knows if we don't use this opportunity to support internal forces, it suggests that in any case, there's still an ambition to create some kind of way forward.
The word of these people For a Kurd, after they've been tricked big time 3 times, they still fall for it the 4th time. When the person offering you anything is also capable of bombing you while making the offer, that's a matter of reputation. I mean, who would buy a car from Netanyahu or from Trump or buy a house from them?
Give a man hope and he will cling to it with all his strength.
Yes, hope, but not nonsense. That's not the point. You know you're serving the interests of people who consider you less than a man. It might be a hope too. But when you know that the person who offered you the deal thinks of you as little more than a platypus, then we're not really talking as equals. Or maybe not, maybe they're controlling me. For example, I manage my neutrality towards the central power in Tehran with a country that has always been hostile to me, the Turks. I mean, I have other options on the table. The fact is, I'm forced to wage war against third parties, to find myself alone in the mountains of northern Iran like a fool after the war is over, with all the other Iranians angry that I betrayed them once again and no one comes to my aid. Come on.
Thank you. Last topic, Ukraine, because obviously in the midst of all this, Ukraine is, let's say, overshadowed. I can tell you that following the latest developments, there have been some Ukrainian counterattacks. Little spoiler, there will be a Ukrainian retreat in the area between Siversk, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk to reorganize the lines. It was the month with the February and March were the months with the lowest number of territorial changes. Yes, 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 yes. The Russians, for example, have taken 25 square kilometers. Then it depends on the source. Go check it out. But in this matter, you can see it shows a lot of little blue arrows in the Kamyansk area. And let's say everything is being reversed. This would be the month with the fewest changes. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, according to internal sources with this connection, because this area, as you can see, is becoming a salient, so it's dangerous. General, these have been two particularly slow months on both sides with few attempts, all of them unsuccessful on both sides. Because two Ukrainians tried aggression with Skala, and before that the Russians towards Iman. It has become a very slow war, even slower than what we had already seen in 2024 and 2025. And I noticed that there isn't much interest. Yes, general states, months with the military, bloggers, Telegram, and so on, about the fact that now in Russia, if you want to go on LinkedIn, you need to have a VPN because Telegram is blocked. And so a lot of people are fed up. They actually write it. Enough, we've been fighting this war for 5 years. We're not getting anywhere. Territorial.
The perspective is that the Russians and the Americans will no longer support the Russians. Yes, 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 yes. They have less and less because they can support whoever they want. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, Europe, which is facing a global energy crisis, will somehow have to deal with it. There's the fact that they have oil and gas. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, someone will have to start considering it. If the problem becomes an issue of years or months, then we're probably talking about maybe by summer, this war will take another path, no longer a military one. Also because partly out of fatigue, partly for one reason, partly for another. No.
But it is all becoming less likely. The willingness to risk troops in an assault like that is decreasing. By the way, let me point this out. For the first time during this war, in March 2026, the Ukrainians launched more long-range drones into Russian territory than the Russians launched into Ukrainian territory.
And read this, take it, reverse the thing, put Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states on one side, and on the other side you see Iran. Here we're talking about two countries that have been at war for 4 years, not 4 days, 4 years, who have been hitting each other hard using an enormous amount of ammunition, and they keep doing it. Look on the other side, we're not even at 38 days, 39 days of fighting. Do you really think that Iran would stop its drone campaign just like that in the span of 4 days?
Well, I think so. I don't think so.
Knowing that the goal of those attacking is the extinction of Iran, not just regime change, well, if I'm going to die anyway, at this point I'd even throw stones at you, not just drones. As long as there's something to throw, I'll throw it. Because I feel like you haven't given me any alternative. Napoleon used to say it, you have to leave. Always leave your enemy an escape route. But if you block their escape route by saying, my goal is your annihilation as a civilization, what alternative does Iran have? What alternative would we have if we were facing being wiped off the face of the earth? If I'm going to die anyway, I'll make it costly for them.
Even the Ukrainians, I see that they're playing their hand right now, betting everything, launching all their drones. Maybe they're doing it on purpose during this time of crisis to limit Russian profits, since they'll definitely try to take advantage of the increased oil prices. So I understand why they make these charts. I also follow Memolin a lot, but then you have to see if it's a deliberate choice to fire everything they can right now to limit Russian profits, or if it's something systematic and they've also reached extremely high volumes of drone production. We'll see that in the coming months. By the way, considering that the Russians are fighting not only against the Ukrainians and against Europe, but especially against themselves. Because of internet censorship, this also greatly affects the way they communicate internally, including their disagreements. There was still a kind of outlet, which was the internet, where Russians could live in an information sphere where they could say more or less what they wanted, but less so now that they're trying to control them. By the way, I find it funny because to thank tonight's sponsor, which is NordVPN, guess which is one of the most used VPNs to get around Russian censorship? It's NordVPN and other types of VPNs, because this especially allows the blogosphere on Telegram and so on to express themselves freely, and I assure you they're becoming more and more caustic. I've seen the most vehement things written by Russian mil bloggers, like the latest conversations I was listening to. They were Russian military bloggers furious who don't want Russia to help Iran or send them anti-aircraft systems. And judging by Clemente Molin's chart, they're right, because they fear that if they send those systems, which are already not enough to cover what they need, let alone if they send them to Iran. So it's seen as a somewhat toxic ally that has already given what it had to give. It gave them the drones, they copied them, and now they don't need it anymore. Non ci serve più.
However, to add something more to what you mentioned, maybe the Ukrainians have reached a very respectable production capacity. So on. An indirect proof is the fact that Zelensky went to Gorfo Persko saying what? If you help us in some way, we'll give you the drones. You can't give something you don't have, so it means that their production levels probably allow them to say in some way we can also help you. Thank you. Promodo, questo è normale, eh? This could be indirect evidence that the Ukrainian industry has somehow reached volumes that allow them to do what you showed so well. However, I remind you, always remember that this drone war has been going on for 4 years, not 4 days, and the term year refers to the drone war. Gulf, when said by an American, is pure terror. It's pure terror, and that's what worries me a bit.
Yes, there's a bit of insider trading, etc. Less on oil futures because you can do insider trading there. You know it's about to explode now, but with futures, those who know it will cost more in a few months. That's already different. So pay attention. They're parallel markets, right? From those betting that something is about to happen and those who go buy futures, the ones who buy futures aren't so positive, and those are going up. So I would say, gentlemen, that I'll see you again on Friday or Saturday when we'll do more in-depth live sessions, or who knows, we'll come back to the Iran issue, because most likely something will or won't have happened. In any case, if the situation stays as it is, it's not good. If they really attack the energy system, it's really bad. So either way, the two scenarios aren't exactly rosy, right, Paolo?
No, not at all. Let's hope a night's sleep brings some wisdom, because it's not about reopening Hormuz, it's about locking up Trump. That's the problem. Anyway, all right.
I'll make myself a t-shirt. Look, with Paolo, it's not about reopening Hormuz, but about locking up Trump.
Thank you.
Maybe she was right, wasn't she? We have to take him back into a golden cage. He loves gold.
No, no, he said inside an iron cage. We might even agree to the golden cage. But let's always ask ourselves why the United States is so submissive to a world that's astonished by their behavior. This is an important question because, one, yes, but there are 360 million of them. That's a lot. You don't just ask a question, but why? Nobody loves us anymore. There you go. We've done something to everyone. The answer contains the question. I swear I'm trembling. Tomorrow morning I'll be on restart on Rye 3, and I don't think I'll have all this time to speak so frankly with you or with those listening to us.
Well, you'll have a window. You have to condense, right?
Yeah, I mean, I won't use vowels. I'll just say the consonants.
The consonants. You can add the rest at home as you like. You can add them at home later.
Got it? No adverbs, nothing. I use a verb in the infinitive, and then I act like a big shot, whatever, okay? For those who remember. Hello?
Hello, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Bye.